Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Rachel Siegel, the Director of Jewish Women's Leadership Programs at Illuminate. Welcome to our Crown Jewel Conversation Series. Illuminate empowers Jewish feminist women leaders and philanthropists, advancing gender equity and social justice. We have created the Collective, our signature leadership advancement program, to train, support, elevate, and connect Jewish women's leadership globally to advance the social change we seek. Illuminate invests in Jewish entrepreneurial women executives and leaders who are devoting their lives to tackling society's most pressing issues throughout the United States, Israel, and around the world. Each year, we select 10 women to be in the Collective's cohort-based leadership program. Our global network is now 60 women strong. Our conversation today features one of our incredible collective members. Jodi Bromberg is the former CEO of 18 Doors, an organization that provides an entry point for millions of interfaith families to connect to each other and Jewish culture, wisdom, and tradition. Under her leadership, 18 Doors expanded its work across the United States and into Canada, as well as the organization's commitment to support tens of thousands of leaders, professionals, educators, and clergy in Jewish organizations on strengthening their understanding of and working with mixed heritage families. She was responsible for the creation of the first ever fellowship for rabbis on interfaith inclusion. Jodi has written in multiple publications and spoken widely on the inclusion of interfaith families. Most recently, she authored a chapter in the book Warm and Welcoming: How the Jewish Community Can Become Truly Diverse in the 21st Century. Jodi has a law degree from Temple University, and she lives outside Boston with her wife and 3 children. Please write any questions that you have in the chat, and we will do our best to incorporate them if time allows. To begin the conversation, I'm pleased to introduce Illuminate's past president, Rachel Weinstein.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Hello, everyone. So great to see you. I hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving. And Jodi, I'm so happy to see you. Whenever I listen to the credentials listed of each of you jewels, I'm always in awe. And I have loved listening you talk about belonging in the Jewish community at other events. So I'm excited that we have this dedicated hour to chat and to share your wisdom with our listeners. For the last 10 years, you were a leader in the interfaith community, working with interfaith families and the community at large. And so you have a very unique and bird's eye perspective. I'd love to hear from you how you think the world has changed in this area. How far have we come and where do we still have to go?
Yes. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Rachel, for such a kind introduction. I think in looking back over the past 10 years, when I joined 18 Doors, it was October 1st, 2013, which was the day that the first Pew report on Jewish Americans came out that talked about the number of interfaith families in Jewish life skyrocketing. And so I come up with a very particular perspective. But really, when I think about what has changed most dramatically in the last decade, I think about rabbis as the leaders in Jewish community and the ways that rabbis have changed and the ways really that seminaries have changed. Because on October 1st, 2013, most of the seminaries in the United States that were ordaining rabbis would not allow rabbis who were married or partnered with someone who was not Jewish to either join the seminary, be admitted, or to get smicha, be ordained as rabbis. And so when I think about what has changed most significantly, most significantly Hebrew Union College, the Reform Rabbi Seminary. They changed their policy just a few months ago, this past spring. Before them, the Hebrew College here in the Boston area. Before them, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College was really, I think, one of the first on the scene to make the big change. And so I think the fact that we will now have role models for interfaith families, so people who are Jewish, who are living Jewish lives, who are married to spouses who aren't Jewish, I think that is a game changer, and we are just beginning to see the impact of that, because you should be able to have folks in the Jewish community who could talk authentically about what it means to be part of interfaith families. So I think that's one. I think the second is just simply the number of rabbis officiating at the weddings of interfaith couples and families. In the Reform movement, I think it has become, so normative that if you don't, you are often seen as, there's a question of like, why aren't you officiating at weddings of interfaith families? And in terms of work to be done, I think despite those incredibly important changes, I think there are still a lot of ouchies that occur. And I think it's one of the reasons I am most proud in my tenure of 18 Doors at having launched the Reuken Rabbinic Fellowship at 18 Doors, which helps rabbis connect with other rabbis who are interested in working with interfaith families and really kind of talk through many of the topics that come up in working effectively with interfaith families.
Yeah. Thank you. I think you have a unique perspective also, and you, like a lot of our jewels, I think so many of you live your work. It's so much ingrained into your identity. And in this particular case, both personally and professionally, you have your own interfaith family. And I'm sort of curious, because I think it's unique to each family, but how you and your wife have gone about, creating and bringing religion into your household. And, like we chose you for this particular month with like Christmas and Hanukkah approaching. Like, do you celebrate Christmaka? I mean, how do you do the holidays at your house? And how did you go about on your journey, from when it was just the two of you and then building out your family to sort of developing how you'd bring religion into your family?
Yeah. So I often joke that my kids are being raised Jewish in Santa. Um, because when 19 years ago, when my wife Courtney and I met, I told her fairly quickly that I wanted Jewish kids and a Jewish home and a puppy. And that if she couldn't give me those things or wasn't interested in those things, then we probably shouldn't continue dating. And so over the course of lots of conversations, one of the things she said to me is, for me, Christmas is such an important time. I have such warm memories with my grandparents, with my family, it's not to me about religion. It's about the familial togetherness of us all being together. And one of the things that I love the most is the magic of Santa, that there's someone who could give you all of these things that you want that maybe your parents wouldn't necessarily buy. And that's really important to me. And so my kids have grown up knowing, believing in Santa until, they got old enough that they don't anymore. And I think that that's, and also the two oldest just had their B'nai Mitzvah. They go to religious school and are important and proud members of the Jewish community and go to Jewish overnight camp. And for me, what it came down to, because I really struggled with this, I was like, I don't know, what does it mean for my kids to celebrate Christmas? And I remember having a conversation with Ed Case, who was the founder of 18 Doors back when it was Interfaith Family. And he said to me, he's like, you shouldn't worry about one day of the year. If you do, something is wrong with the way that you are approaching Jewish life and your children. And so I always think back on that. I'm like, there are 364 other days of the year for my kids to embrace Jewish life and community, and they have. And so to give my wife, who has taken such a central role in raising them Jewish, this one day of the year around Christmas and the hoopla that exists around Christmas, I mean that in a happy, positive way, that was something I could give her in return for her agreement to raise our kids Jewish and in all that entails. And so, I think for me, it's the everyday in and out of Judaism and Judaism in the home. And so thinking about like when you wake up in the morning, what do you say? You say, Modam Ani, like, thank you, God, for giving me another day. I talk about like, hey, children, there's a prayer for when you go to the bathroom. We celebrate Shabbat most Friday evenings at home, and many of them we make challah together. So having the kind of day in and day out experience of Jewish life, I think, has been so integral to me. And also like the understanding of like religion, we think about the religion as binary because of the religious beliefs. But I think when you think about interfaith families, most interfaith families aren't approaching them in a binary perspective. They're just trying to expose their children to their communal traditions that were important to them growing up, to establish close, loving relationships with their grandparents and cousins, and and really just to bring more love into the world. And I think ultimately that's what we're all trying to do.
I think that's so beautiful. And I would imagine, I mean, you say that so many people talk about it in a binary way, but if we really look at religion, right, there's so much overlap, right? In the values also, right? So it's a both and, right? Not an either or. And I'm just sort of curious, just to probe you a little further, like your kids, have they ever asked you about the both? Like, or is it just so common now, or is it just what they've always known? Is it so common that they have a lot of other friends now with so many more interfaith families who are celebrating both sets of holidays? Do they go to religious school, and do the kids say, well, Santa's not real? Or like, how does that manifest sort of, or they haven't really come up against
Yeah.
that?
It's interesting because I think the thing that they have often talked about is like, oh, mama, my wife Courtney, mama's not Jewish and we are, right? So I think they're very clear in their identity that they're Jewish, and they have a mama who's not Jewish but is very much Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we have lots of conversations about, I think, the overlap that exists between religions, and, often talk about how, Mama's religion, which is, she's Catholic, uh, it, it starts off where our story ends, right? And, and so that there's a commonality among our Torah and Catholicism's Old Testament, certainly. And also that it's really important to maintain holidays and religious traditions in their own separate ways. Like, and so we talk about Hanukkah and we celebrate Hanukkah and we celebrate Christmas. And, like there's not a merging of the two in a like religious way. I mean, Christmas obviously this year is also the first night of Hanukkah. So, we'll have Christmas in the morning and then like latkes at night and light our Hanukkahs and, open some gifts. So it's, I think it can also be constantly changing and navigating territory, where it's not, I think often there is an understanding of when interfaith families make a decision in their lives about how they're going to raise their children or about their homes, it's one and done. You have one conversation. We had that conversation about, having a Jewish home and Jewish kids and a puppy, and that's it. But that's not really how real life is. It's a constantly navigating number of conversations of like, hey, does this feel right? What questions do you have about your kids, our kids going to overnight camp, which was really important to me that they had an experience of going away to Jewish sleepaway camp because it was so pivotal in my upbringing. And so I think it's really just keeping the lines of communication open, among you and your spouse and your family members. I think for my kids, we've been really open and honest with them about why it was important to them, why it was important to me to have a Jewish home and raise them Jewish, and also why it was important to Courtney, why she said yes, and got on board with and has really been a driving force along with me, a real partner in having a Jewish home and raising Jewish kids.
I imagine that those conversations continued recently. I know you just talked about that your children just had their B'nai Mitzvah. And I'm sort of wondering, about those kinds of rites of passage, especially ones that are so, Jewish rites of passage, and how you navigate that as an interfaith couple.
Yeah, and I think it was a moment where we were thinking really hard about what we wanted, what our children wanted as twins, so navigating each of their own personalities and interests, and making sure that, you know, how do you kind of balance out each of their own experiences so that they're getting what they want. And I think it was also a moment where, if I'm really honest and candid about it, that I think, Courtney experienced, some what I like to call like ouchies within like the Jewish community, because I think she often felt like she wasn't being given credit for the decision that she had made to raise Jewish kids. And the real thought that she put into and the time and attention she put into that decision 11 13 14 years ago, when our oldest were born, but also all the steps along the way, and felt like there was kind of a dismissiveness around the B'nai Mitzvah experience, with the way that people kind of sometimes talk to her, as opposed to like this was a moment of real joy for her, and a moment that she wanted to stand up on the bima, and did stand up on the bima, and talk to the kids, as did I, about why this moment was so critically important for them. So I think that's where some of the work is to still be done, is how do you identify those, for rabbis, for members of the community, and try and have open, honest conversations about how some of the things that folks say land, because they're well-meaning, they just land slightly askew.
Yeah. And I imagine that, being so steeped in this, like you've been very thoughtful about the community that you've chosen and the congregation that you've chosen and the rabbi that you've chosen, and you've chosen one that is, inclusive and understanding, and that she's still coming up against these ouchies, as you say. It makes me believe that, families who don't have that, right, who don't have that same community, are feeling it that much more. Are there specific things that, we as listeners like might inadvertently be doing that are creating those ouchies, that we could sort of identify so that people could think about in a way that might make them think twice going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some of the same things that are true when talking about other forms of inclusion. So one, don't assume how people identify, or assume why they made the decisions that they did. I think that's generally good advice. And I would say, nothing about us without us. So make sure, when you're thinking about or planning programs for interfaith families or policies around interfaith families, that you have representation from interfaith families themselves. And I will say, we are a diverse population. And, as in like the broader Jewish community, you asked, what, two Jews, three opinions? And I think that's true for interfaith families in Jewish life as well. So, that it really has to be about the representation in your synagogue, in your community. And we are blessed to belong to Kerem Shalom in Concord up here in Massachusetts, a wonderful community that has made actually including interfaith families part of its strategic plan and process. And so, I think we are in such a wonderful place. And also, like, things also happen that hurt feelings. And I think what's really important is to be able to have those conversations and to be able for everyone to listen with whole hearts. And, you know, we're not always going to get it right. And also to be able to step back and look at something as if you are a person walking into the congregation for the first time, or the organization for the first time. And so if you are using Hebrew words or Hebrew language, you know, to make it really second nature, to not only to transliterate them, but also to have the English interpretations there so that people can take advantage of understanding what that is. And, you know, for our family, our rabbi is profoundly deaf, so there's a lot of American Sign Language in our congregational, you know, services, and that was a real bonus for my wife, who works in the deaf and hard of hearing community. And so there were times where things were interpreted into from Hebrew into ASL, so that she had a greater understanding even than I did, who's often, you know, left decoding and doesn't have a great knowledge base of Hebrew. So it was, you know, another way in for her. And so I think just really to look at what are the opportunities for people to find their ways in.
I sort of love that, actually. I'd love to probe a little what you're saying about, the diversity of interfaith families also, because, and at Illuminate, we talk a lot about intersectionality, that we're like the total sum of all of our parts, right? Jewish, woman, mother, whatever all of these things are. And you are not only an interfaith couple, but you're a gay couple. And I'm guessing that also comes with a layer of complexity. I mean, those are two categories that, looking back at traditional Judaism, were excluded. So I'm sort of wondering, like, how does that extra layer manifest?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because it manifests today in ways that I could not have imagined even 5 years ago. You know, I wrote a reflection this year, the anniversary of October 7th. And that was the day, I think, for me, I always knew that we would have to worry about homophobia and anti-gay hate, and that, you know, just growing up in the United States as a gay person, that's just, you know, part and parcel of your experience. And what I didn't know was the way that the surge in anti-Semitism, certainly the atrocities of October 7th, but what's happening here in the United States really since, you know, since 2016, 2017 in Charlottesville, and the spike in anti-Semitism we've seen. And so I think having to look at places that we might go, and look at it through a number of different lenses, like, you know, is this safe for women? Is this safe for lesbians? Is this safe for Jews? And that's like a constant calculation that we are doing and thinking about, in terms of you know, places that we might visit or travel to, or just really how we navigate our lives. And so I think when we think about the intersection of identities, you know, that's one way that it's come up, I think, in more negative ways than I might have anticipated even a couple of years ago. You know, and I think on the positive ways, I think about, you know, there was a book called Lesbian Rabbis that came out in the, like, I think early 1990s, that was really pivotal for me and my sense of Jewish identity, because it was about it was an anthology of essays by lesbian rabbis, and I had no idea that there were lesbian rabbis out there. And while I didn't want to go to rabbinic school myself, it was really a pivotal moment in understanding my Jewish identity. And so, you know, I think the layers of identity and the connections that we make around them can be so pivotal to our growth and to our understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Yeah, for sure. I want to talk a little bit about your not-for-profit leadership. I mean,
Yep.
the last 10 years saw economic swings, political swings, a pandemic, a significant rise in anti-Semitism, or at least, overt
Yep.
anti-Semitism. So I wanted to ask a little bit about, what that was like for you as a leader, generally. And then as a follow-up question, I wanted to talk a little bit about how anti-Semitism uniquely presents in the interfaith community.
Yep. Yep. I think the pandemic, the rise in anti-Semitism, October 7th, I think they were challenging moments for leadership. And they were challenging moments just as human beings. And for us, I think I was so proud at 18 Doors of some of the things that we did in those moments where we leaned into people's humanity. And we had more than one person on our staff who were parents of young children and really had to kind of step back their workload because they were caring for them at home because there was no other access to childcare. And I remember, not too long after the pandemic, not ended, but subsided, we got a beautiful note from this one staff person for the ways that we had really seen her and showed up as an organization in that moment of saying, listen, take a step back from your workload. Let's talk about what needs to get done and what we can push off for the next moment. And I think that just had such a profound impact on her, that it's, one of the things that I'm proudest of as a leader is that, in these moments of real crisis that we showed up for our people, uh, because it's really your staff and your employees, and your team that are everything. It is, they do the work day in and day out. And, I think one of the things that we're incumbent upon in nonprofit leadership is to show up for our teams, in big ways and small. And so that to me was one of the most important. And I think in terms of the rise in anti-Semitism, um, you know, 18 Doors was uniquely situated because what we were seeing from interfaith families around anti-Semitism was a different perspective than I think is seen in the broader Jewish population. I remember this one horrible story, that a parent told me about, when her daughter got engaged. She said her daughter's fiance was out at a bar with some of his oldest friends, after they had gotten engaged, and one of them turned to him and said, "I can't believe your mom is letting you marry a Jew."
Wow.
And I don't think, and he didn't have maybe the language to respond effectively. He actually punched the guy, uh, which is an understandable reaction, though not, nobody
Right.
here, I'm sure, would condone violence. But I think part of what we have to do is we have to give people who aren't Jewish, who love people who are, the language to talk about anti-Semitism and to talk about it so that they become allies in this work. And many are allies in this work, but may not have the language for how to talk about it effectively. And I think that's so much of the work that needs to be done. And I think, one of the things that, besides the Rook and Ribbon Fellowship that I was really proud of in my tenure at 18 Doors, was, launching work fighting anti-Semitism and a partnership with the Anti-Defamation League, because interfaith families do have a unique role to play in this fight and the allyship behind it.
Yeah, for sure. Tell us a little, because people might not know about 18 Doors and the rebranding and what that signifies.
Mhm. Yeah, for me, it was really a moment of, we had heard again and again that interfaith family was not um, a name that resonated with the interfaith families and couples that we were trying to reach. And so we wanted a name that was going to emphasize the diversity of interfaith families and Jewish lives experiences, that was going to emphasize the number of doors that people could walk through on their Jewish journeys, that was going to have a nod to Le Dor Vador, the generation after generation of passing down Jewish life and tradition. And so, really worked with a marketing firm in New York City to figure out if there was a name that and a brand that would work better than Interfaith Family did. And we were just about at the point where we thought, well, maybe we'll just shorten it. We'll just be IFF. When in one of the last rounds of names, 18 Doors was one of the names that came up. And the people in the room, as we were going through names, were like, that's the one. It's evocative of Jewish life and Jewish organization without being something that is hard to understand because it's a Jewish word or uses Hebrew language, which, while important, can sometimes be a barrier to entry. And so, went through the rebranding process. And, I think what it has resulted in is just many, many more millions of people finding us and finding the website than would have back when we were Interfaith Family. And so I think really seeing the proof of that in the rise of the number of visitors to our website and our digital engagement since has been really, really gratifying.
That's amazing. There's such a welcoming aspect to it as well, right?
Yeah.
So I know you've just enjoyed a bit of time off, although planning a B'nai Mitzvah is definitely not time off. And you had like a moment, to catch your breath after leaving 18 Doors. And I'm just sort of wondering what you're thinking about next.
Yeah. So, I'd had a number of friends approach me about like asking for advice about running nonprofits or asking about strategic planning or asking about interfaith families. And so I actually launched a consulting firm, within the last few weeks, really just to in response to what I was hearing from folks, to begin doing some of the projects that people have kind of brought to me and said, like, could you help us with this? So I'm doing a little bit of that. I'm doing some writing and really also thinking about where might be the right next steps for me in terms of leadership. There are so many opportunities, I think, for nonprofit organizations to step in and help in this particular moment in time. And unfortunately, there's so many things wrong with our world at this particular moment. And so trying to figure out, where is the best spot for kind of my uniquely situated expertise and talents and in this particular moment.
Yeah, well, for what it's worth, I know you said you decided not to go to rabbinic school, but I think you'd make an incredible rabbi.
Thank you.
And I think it would be an amazing moment to talk about because I was intrigued. We were intrigued by that piece of artwork behind you. And I think it would be, following what you just said, a really interesting moment to tell us a little bit about the piece of artwork behind you.
So that is a paper cutting by Mindy Shapiro, who's a wonderful artist in the Philadelphia area. And it was given to, this one was given to the first cohort of the Rukun Rabbinic Fellowship of the rabbis who made up the first cohort. And it is a quote from Esther. And the quote is, this is perhaps, this is the moment for which you have been created. And I think is so much about, rabbis in this moment and all of us really taking advantage for making the use of the best, highest purpose of our gifts and talents. And all due credit, I should say, goes to Rabbi Robin Frisch, who is the director of the Rukun Rabbinic Fellowship, who worked with Mindy to find exactly the right paper cutting. But it is one of my favorite things that we have done at 18 Doors, and that hangs in my home as a piece of art. So thank you for asking about it.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful message, like for all of us, really, about whatever we're coming up against, whether it's a happy moment or a huge challenge. Perhaps this is the moment for which you were created. And
Yeah.
it's like a beautiful guide. So I love that. I want to just invite anyone who might have a question that you'd like us to ask to put it in the chat. And while people are doing that, I want to just ask you, Jodi, about your experience in the collective and how that's been for you, how it's impacted your leadership, or, about the relationships you've developed, anything you'd like to share about your experience.
Yeah. I mean, I will say, I have learned so much from the other members of the collective, of Rachel, you and the other lay leaders, from the staff of Illuminate, from Jamie Ellen Black, who was a lot of the driving force of creating the transition to this particular program or project, that I feel so grateful for, to all that that I have learned and gotten from being a member of a cohort of really strong, sophisticated Jewish women, who are all, working to make change for the good in our world today. And it's, I had the opportunity to meet people I would have never otherwise crossed paths with. And in fact, just, recently had dinner with two members of other cohorts of the collective. One was visiting from California and was here for a couple days, and one is here in Boston, but leads a secular secular organization. And we would never have met if it were not for the collective. And they have become good friends and good colleagues. And I think that's, one piece. And I think the other is just the way that it pushed me to grow my leadership and to think about my leadership from a feminist perspective, from a Jewish perspective. And that, and so much of that was Ruth Messenger and her wisdom, and what she brings to, kind of pushing us to think about moral courage and moral leadership, and what underpins that in Jewish teachings, and bringing that all together in really beautiful ways.
Yeah. One of my favorite Illuminate moments with you, actually, Jodi, was we were having an event where we had sort of a discussion about belonging in the Jewish community. And the panel was you and Rabba Sarah, who runs Yeshiva Maharat, which is a yeshiva that ordains Orthodox rabbis. And it's so rare that the two of you, interfaith family and modern and orthodoxy, which seem at the opposite ends of a spectrum, would somehow be together speaking about something so common as belonging. And here it was. And so that's sort of one of the things that I do love about Illuminate, is in the way that we look for commonality between people instead of separation. And
Yes.
that was one of my favorite moments. I see we have a couple questions in the chat, and the first is from, and I want to welcome Jamie Allen Black, who is our former CEO. Jamie, we're so thrilled to have you with us today. Illuminate focuses on social change. How do you see the work of interfaith families as social change in addition to direct service?
Yeah, I think it's a great question.
Yeah.
And so much of the work of interfaith families, both within the Jewish community and outside of it, I think now more than ever is about social change. In part because, what I was talking about earlier about anti-Semitism, that members of our families who aren't Jewish are uniquely situated to play a role in fighting anti-Semitism, because they are going to hear things, be exposed to things that people may not say, if they know that there are Jewish people around, like that horrible scene in the bar, or, that they can stand up for Jewish communities in ways that it is harder for Jewish community members to be able to. So I think that is just, one aspect of social change. But I think the other is the ways that thinking about inclusion and belonging and expanding the tent of what it means to be part of Jewish life and Jewish community is a lesson that we can take outside of Jewish life and community to the broader world, to think about, what does belonging look like in the United States? What does the belonging look like in Israel? What does belonging look like in the rest of the world? And how do we bring the lessons that we've learned as being welcoming and cultivating belonging for interfaith families and Jewish life to the rest of our communities and the rest of the world?
Yeah. We have someone who's listening who is part of an interfaith family and, talked about after October 7th, or, think that many non-Jewish partners in interfaith couples have gotten, as she calls, a crash course in sort of anti-Semitism, as we're seeing this rise everywhere. And at Illuminate, we talk a lot about the theories of change, right? It's one of the ways that we look at the work that our jewels are doing and changing behaviors, changing policies, that's all part of it. And those are all things that you're doing through the work at 18 Doors. So many questions are flooding in. So I'm going to backtrack. Just like revisiting the intersectionality piece, and also one of the core tenets of Illuminate and what we look for in leadership of our jewels is this idea of feminist leadership. Can you talk a little about your feminist leadership and, and how feminism is the thread in your leadership?
Yeah. Yeah. In some ways it feels so hard to pick out the pieces that are feminist leadership, because it feels like it's so integral to, I think, my approach to leadership generally. But what I will say is I think that generally my approach toward collaboration and my kind of toward wanting to bring everyone into the conversation, I think is, as opposed to kind of a strong hierarchy, I think it begins with feminist leadership. So I think that's one piece. If I had a dime for every time someone told me I was too nice, I would be very financially well off, because and I think kindness and feminist leadership go hand in hand. And kindness doesn't mean not telling the truth or not sharing difficult information, but it does mean treating people the way that you might want to be treated in a particular situation, or approaching things kind of with grace and dignity, whether that's separating a staff member, or delivering hard feedback, or something else. And so I think so much of that is about feminist leadership, because I think it's incumbent upon us to make to have work environments that are really are as positive and as kind as possible in every way. And I think the third way is just simply policies. We went through a process of surveying our staff to ask them what, in terms of vacation policy, what days do they think the organization should be closed? And that led us to closing for the last week of the year as an organization. And then later, subsequently closing for the week of the 4th of July, so that people had time to catch their breath and weren't coming back to an inbox that was filled to overflowing. And I think the last thing I'll say, it was also part of us going to an entirely remote organization, and giving up our office space here in the Boston area, because what we heard from people is they wanted the flexibility of their lives, and they didn't want to have to show up to a particular office at a particular time. And so what it forced us to do was really think about, how do we cultivate relationships as a remote workforce, as a dispersed workforce, which most of our organization had been for many years prior to the pandemic, and it just really completed that cycle. And just continuing to think through, how do we build relationships, and how do we build, even when we're not in the same room more than once or twice a year, and what are the ways that we can do that and cultivate relationships? And I think relationships and feminist leadership go hand in hand.
100%. Switching gears a little, because there are a lot of different questions coming in through the chat. One of the popular television shows that has come out on the Netflix streaming platform recently is Nobody Wants This, which
Yep.
is about a rabbi meeting a shiksa, a non-Jewish woman, and you know, a rom-com around that. What do you think about the program? Like, what do you think about its representation here? You know, is it good for the Jewish community? I guess, you know, there's a bit of controversy about it.
Totally. I think a couple things. One, I will say, my wife and I watched it. We binge watched it over like, I don't know, a long weekend and loved it as like a rom-com.
Yeah.
And as like a fun series to watch. Were there absolutely, cringeworthy stereotypes of Jewish women throughout the episodes? Absolutely. And I think I think it is right to speak out in response to that about the negativity of the stereotypes. And also like some of the stereotypes that existed around the person who isn't Jewish. And her, at some point, Courtney turned to me and there was something that the woman didn't know. And Courtney looked at me and was like, seriously, she grew up in New York and didn't know that particular phrase. And I think it was a moment where, maybe the flip side of that is the person who wasn't Jewish didn't get the credit maybe that she might have deserved growing up in a major metropolitan area that has a large population of Jewish people in it, or Los Angeles, I think, so I think that's one piece. And also I'll say like, there's often like the phrase in PR that there's like no bad publicity. And I think that the same is true here, that there's this piece of wanting more series, more television that exposes people to Jewish traditions, Jewish concepts in everyday life in these really mainstream comedies or mainstream productions that I think is really phenomenal. The Real Housewives of Salt Lake City has featured, Rabbi Ruth Abush Magdar in a couple of the recent episodes. I think that's amazing. I think the more that the rest of the world, who often aren't in connection with Jewish life or community in any way, may not even know any Jewish people, the more that there is any exposure, that takes us from all the way out here and brings us a little closer and makes it a little less unknown or mysterious, I think the better. And I'll also want to give a shout out to Ed Case, the founder of Interfaith Family 18 Doors, who now runs the Center for Radically Inclusive Judaism. He has a great newsletter that comes out every month, and the most recent one has kind of a roundup of some of the commentary on the Netflix series. So want to just also encourage folks to check it out.
That's interesting. Yes, we enjoyed it too. And sometimes we know that these shows take creative license for the purpose of the comedy part to sort of over exaggerate characters. The number of people who reached out to me after, I think it's episode 6 about my scratchy choker, it's because Rachel Weinstein, right? I was like, yeah. But also just going back without giving any spoilers to anyone who may not have had a chance to watch it yet, like you have initiated programs that would make it so that some of the characters in the show would not have to make the choices that they make, or would not be faced with an either or situation, that it could be a both and. And I think, obviously for dramatic tension, there needs to be that. But I think what I'm happy to hear you talk about is the fact that that might not necessarily be the case in real life.
Yeah. And let me, Rachel, just say one other thing. I think anytime families put pressure on their family members around endogamy, around only marrying other Jewish people or only being in a relationship with other Jewish people, I think it can be really challenging because it's not the world that we live in. And, the rise in the number of interfaith families in Jewish life is directly attributable to the overall decline over the last several generations in anti-Semitism and in Jews having to live in closed communities and belong to only, have only Jewish law firms or have only Jewish organizations because they weren't permitted to be part of the organizations or law firms that were for Christian people. And so I think this, understanding the rise in interfaith families as directly attributable to our integration in the larger US society and acceptance of in the larger society by Jews being accepted by people who aren't Jewish.
Thank you. I have 3 last questions, which I'm going to whiz through because we're running out of time. Do you think as Jewish individuals that your children will carry both sets of traditions of, mostly Judaism with Christmas
Yep.
forward into their lives? Or do you think that that's part of who they are now and what they will continue to have?
I have no idea. I mean, we didn't talk about my family of origin. I grew up, my mom converted to Judaism before she married my dad, who was born and raised Jewish. And so we would go to my grandma's house to celebrate Christmas every year. We never believed in Santa. That wasn't kind of a thing for us growing up. And my mom was very adamant that there not be any celebration of Christmas at our home. And so I don't know, I think what I would hope is, I'm just seeing the beginnings of my oldest two really beginning to understand their identity as their own, and their Jewish identity as their own. So like, their last, what they did last week at Hebrew school is they began talking about creating their own prayers. And so I think, in the same way, I think it's probably likely that they'll continue to celebrate Christmas in the way that they grew up with, which is like, Christmas dinner and the Christmas tree and stockings and, Santa coming down the chimney. But I don't know. It'll be, I think it probably will have a lot to do with, as they grow and mature, if they are fortunate enough to find their bashert, their beloved, what influence that person has on their lives. But I'm so curious and can't wait to find out.
Of course. It feels like we're going from bouncing to extremes here, but obviously, October 7th has created, very different perspectives on Israel, within the Jewish community, between Jews and non-Jews. I mean, how is that coming up with interfaith families? Or,
Yeah.
you're privy to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really complicated. And I think it's really complicated within the Jewish community right now. And I think it's really complicated when you bring in folks who aren't Jewish, who weren't raised with a connection to Israel. And I think what is important in all of these conversations is for us to have open, honest dialogue and to have as big a tent as we can in the Jewish community to hold really the space for difficult conversations. And that more dialogue is better. Because I think what I see happening, and this is not just true to interfaith families, but to Jewish families. I know a Jewish family who stopped belonging to their synagogue because they felt like it was no longer a space that represented their ideals around Israel. And I know interfaith families who feel the same way. And so I think for us to be able to hold as broad a tent as possible around conversations around Israel, I think is critically important in this moment. And, you know, and to be able to have resources to hold those conversations, like, you know, I think of the organization Resetting the Table, because we are stronger when we are together, but together doesn't mean that we all share the same views. And that is part of belonging, is being able to hold disparate views, whether that's on politics, whether that's on Israel, whether that is, you know, whether that is really on policy decisions. It's hard to do. I don't pretend that it is easy. It is hard, you know, it is hard for me to sit across someone who thinks that anti-gay legislation is the right way to go, for example, as a gay person. But I think it is more important than ever for us to try and understand why people make the decisions that they do and why things are important to them. And that we are often now more than ever in these kind of echo chambers because of the way that you know, streaming and cable has and the internet has proliferated and made it really easy for us just to hear from people who agree with us. And I think that's a real mistake.
Yeah. We are so butting up against our time. So I'm going to ask you one last question, and hopefully you can answer
be
in just a
quick.
second or less. We're going to refer people to the 18 Doors website, which will give lots of resources. But are there one or two concrete steps that synagogues can take to make interfaith families feel more welcome?
Yeah. I think one of the most concrete steps that they can take is something that Barry Schrage, who led the CJP, the Boston Federation here for many, many years, did, which was to let them know that they are welcome and to add language to every single piece of communication that you are sending out that says that interfaith families, and even better if you broaden that out to Jews of color or families of color or LGBTQIA Jews, to let folks know that there is a space for them, because particularly in this moment of divisiveness in our country, I think often people will think that they are not part of who you mean when you do outreach, unless you explicitly say that. And so that's one piece. And then I think the second would be just to understand the interfaith families in your community. And if you haven't done surveys or a listening tour of their experiences, you know, I would encourage Jewish organizations and synagogues to do a listening tour of the interfaith families in their midst, and see what they learn and build on that.
Thank you so much, Jodi. It was such a wonderful hour with you, and thank you for sharing your wisdom and your experience, and we'll hope to see you in person soon.
The pleasure was mine, Rachel. Thank you so much for having me. This is wonderful.
Rachel?
Yes. Thank you so much, Jodi, for sharing your story with us and the work that you've been doing. We're so proud to support your leadership at Illuminate. And thank you, as always, Rachel, for leading us through this really incredible conversation. Eva's put a few links in the chat for more ways to learn about 18 Doors and to stay connected with Jodi and this work. It was so wonderful to see many of you today and also at Illuminate's convening a few weeks ago. If you were unable to be there, we're putting a link in the chat to share some highlights. Please also save the date for our annual luncheon on Tuesday, May 13th, and register for our next Crown Jewel conversation on January 9th with Ruth Zakarin, the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. As we approach year-end giving for 2024, we encourage you to make a generous gift to Illuminate. We offer these sessions at no cost to you. As women's rights and empowerment are under increasing threat at home and abroad, Illuminate understands the unique challenges faced by women leaders on the front lines and are supporting them as they battle the world. By investing in Illuminate, you are investing in Jewish women's leadership, and we need each other right now. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you soon and wishing you a happy Hanukkah and New Year.